The carriage wheels clattered to an urgent stop on the cobblestones outside Pembroke House, and Eleanor Ashworth clutched her worn grey dress as she hurried up the grand steps, her heart pounding with a dread that had nothing to do with her exertion. June 15th, 1815. Would be remembered in London society for many things, but for Eleanor it would forever be marked as the day her carefully ordered world tilted off its axis. The great mahogany doors swung open before she could knock, revealing the butler's grave expression that confirmed what the hastily delivered message had only hinted at. Inside, the usual pristine order of the ducal household had given way to controlled chaos, with servants scurrying past carrying linens and basins, their faces etched with worry for their master. Eleanor found the Duchess Margaret in the morning room, her normally composed features crumpled with maternal anguish, her hands twisting a delicate handkerchief into knots. "Oh, Eleanor, thank heaven you've come," the older woman breathed, rising to grasp Eleanor's hands with surprising strength. "It's Alexander, my son. The physicians say—" Her voice broke, and Eleanor felt her own chest tighten with an emotion she dared not examine too closely. The story tumbled out in fragments between the Duchess's tears. A new stallion, notoriously difficult to handle, a jump attempted too soon, Alexander thrown violently against a stone wall, his head bearing the brunt of the impact. The finest physician in London had already been summoned, had already examined the Duke, had already delivered his devastating verdict. "He breathes, but he does not wake," the Duchess whispered, her blue eyes, so like her son's, swimming with unshed tears. "Dr. Morrison speaks of a coma, of damage to the brain, of perhaps never—" She could not finish the sentence, and Eleanor squeezed her employer's hands, offering what comfort she could, while her own mind reeled with the implications. Alexander Pembroke, the man who commanded every room he entered, who made lesser men quake with a single raised eyebrow, who danced through London society with the grace of a predator and the charm of a prince, now lay insensible in his bed, reduced to mere flesh and failing breath. The Duchess suddenly gripped Eleanor's arm with renewed urgency. "I must ask something of you, my dear, something beyond your usual duties as my companion," she said, her voice steadying with purpose. "I cannot bear to leave him alone, but I find myself quite overcome. Would you sit with him? Just for a short while, so I might rest and gather my strength? The nurses are competent, but they are strangers, and I would have someone near him who—" She paused, searching for words. "Someone who understands the value of a life beyond its title." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, even as she nodded her consent, knowing she could never refuse this woman who had shown her such kindness, knowing too that sitting vigil over Alexander Pembroke would test every ounce of composure she had cultivated over years of rendering herself invisible in grand ballrooms and elegant drawing rooms where she did not belong. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The sick room held the peculiar quality of twilight, despite the multiple candles burning on every available surface, their golden light fighting valiantly against the encroaching shadows of evening that pressed against the tall windows like uninvited guests seeking entry to this chamber of suspended life. Eleanor paused at the threshold, her hand trembling slightly on the brass door handle as she gathered her courage to enter this most private sanctum where Alexander Pembroke lay in his unnatural slumber, the mighty Duke reduced to stillness on the grand four-poster bed that dominated the room. The nurse, a competent woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, rose from her chair beside the bed and approached Eleanor with a whispered report of unchanged vital signs and steady breathing before taking her leave with promises to return within the hour should she be needed. Now truly alone with him for the first time in all her years of service to his mother, Eleanor felt the weight of the moment settle upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak as she moved closer to the bed, her soft footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet. Alexander lay perfectly still against the white linens, his dark hair dishevelled in a way she had never seen it, always so perfectly arranged for society's scrutiny, and the sight of this small vulnerability made her heart constrict with an emotion she had long trained herself to suppress. She settled into the chair, still warm from the nurse's presence, and studied his face in the candlelight, noting the bruising that marred his left temple where he had struck the stone wall, the way his chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, the absolute stillness of features that were usually so animated with authority and purpose. Without conscious thought, her hand moved to the basin of cool water on the bedside table, wringing out a soft cloth to gently press against his fevered brow, the heat of his skin alarming against her fingers. "Your Grace," she whispered, then caught herself with a rueful smile at the formality of addressing an unconscious man. "Though I suppose such proprieties matter little now when you cannot hear me." The words, once begun, seemed to flow of their own accord as she continued her gentle ministration, carefully cooling his face and neck while her voice filled the silence that pressed upon the room like a living thing. "I have watched you, you know," she confessed to his still form, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the walls themselves might judge her presumption. "From the shadows of 100 ballrooms where I stood behind your mother's chair, invisible as all good companions should be, memorizing the way you move through the world with such confidence, such certainty of your place in it." She dipped the cloth again, wringing it carefully before returning to her task, unaware that behind those closed eyelids, Alexander Pembroke's consciousness burned bright and aware, trapped in a body that refused to obey his desperate commands to move, to speak, to show any sign that he heard every word falling from the lips of this woman he had never truly noticed before this moment of enforced stillness and terrible clarity. Morning light crept through the heavy curtains with tentative fingers, painting golden stripes across the Persian carpet and illuminating the figure of Eleanor Ashworth, still seated in her vigil beside the Duke's bed, her grey dress now wrinkled from a night spent in the uncomfortable chair, her hair escaping its careful pins to frame a face drawn with exhaustion, yet somehow more animated than it had ever appeared in the formal confines of society gatherings. She had not left his side since the previous evening, sending away the nurse with quiet assurances that she would maintain the watch, and now, as she reached for the leather-bound volume on the bedside table, her movements carried the easy familiarity of one who has passed through the initial awkwardness of an unusual situation into a strange sort of comfort. "I thought we might enjoy some Byron this morning, Your Grace," she murmured to the still form before her, opening the book to a well-worn page. "Though I confess, I find his work rather overwrought at times. All that dramatic suffering and tortured passion, when really most of life's disappointments could be solved with a good cup of tea and an honest conversation." Her voice carried a note of gentle mockery that would have shocked anyone who knew her only as the silent, grey shadow hovering at the edges of ballrooms. And as she began to read aloud, she unconsciously adopted different voices for the various characters, bringing the poetry to life with a theatrical flair she had never dared display in public. Alexander, trapped in his prison of flesh and bone, found himself hanging on every word, every inflection, discovering in this woman he had dismissed as merely another piece of his mother's household furniture, a sharp wit and keen intelligence that transformed Byron's melodrama into something approaching comedy. When she paused to turn the page, she glanced at his face and sighed, setting the book aside to refresh the cloth for his forehead, her touch infinitely gentle as she spoke again. "You know, I've often wondered what you read when you're alone in your study, away from all the expectations and performances of your position," she confided, smoothing the covers with absent care. "Whether you prefer the philosophers or the poets, the historians or the novelists, though I suspect you lean toward military treatises and political theory, always preparing for the next debate in Lords, the next challenge to your authority." She laughed softly, a sound like silver bells that Alexander had never heard from her before, and continued with growing boldness. "How horrified society would be to hear me speaking so freely to you like this, without the proper deference and carefully measured words. But then again, society would be horrified by most of my thoughts if they could hear them. All my observations about their ridiculous pretensions and empty conversations, the way they flutter around you like moths to a flame, never seeing the man beneath the title, never bothering to wonder if perhaps their incessant chatter bores you as much as it bores me." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows at a lower angle now, casting longer shadows across the sick-room floor as the door opened to admit the Duchess of Pembroke, her usually composed features bearing the strain of worry, though she attempted a brave smile for Eleanor's benefit. "My dear Eleanor, you are kindness itself to maintain such devoted watch over my son," the Duchess said softly, approaching the bed where Alexander lay motionless, her hand reaching out to briefly touch his forehead before turning her attention fully to her companion. "The household speaks of nothing but your dedication, sitting here through the night without rest, and I confess I hardly know how to express my gratitude." Eleanor rose from her chair, attempting to smooth her wrinkled grey dress with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion, but the Duchess waved away her attempts at formality with a gentle gesture. "Please sit, you must be weary beyond measure, and I only came to assure myself that Alexander remains stable and to implore you to take some rest, though I know how stubborn you can be when you set your mind to helping someone." The older woman's eyes misted with unshed tears as she gazed upon her son's still form, and Eleanor felt her own heart constrict with sympathy for a mother's pain. "He has always been so strong, so vital, to see him brought low like this." The Duchess's voice trailed off, and she composed herself with visible effort before continuing. "But I take comfort knowing he has you here, someone with such a gentle heart to watch over him in his time of need." With a final pat to Eleanor's shoulder and a whispered blessing over her son, the Duchess departed, leaving Eleanor once more alone with Alexander and the weight of unspoken truths that pressed upon her chest like a physical burden. She sank back into the chair, her body aching from maintaining the same position for so many hours, and found herself speaking again to fill the oppressive silence. "Your mother loves you so deeply, Your Grace, though I suppose all mothers love their sons, even when those sons grow into powerful dukes who intimidate half of London with a mere glance." Her voice carried a note of wistful sadness as she continued, her fingers absently pleating the fabric of her skirt. "My own mother loved me too, before the fever took her, though I sometimes wonder if she would be disappointed to see what I've become, a shadow in service to others, invisible and overlooked, while my sister Caroline shines like a diamond in every ballroom." The words tumbled out now, a confession to unhearing ears that somehow made the telling easier. "You've danced with Caroline, of course, at the Fairfax ball last season, and why wouldn't you? For she is everything a young lady should be, beautiful and accomplished and charming, while I am merely the elder sister who holds her shawl and fetches her lemonade when she grows warm from too much dancing." Alexander, trapped within his unresponsive body, felt each word like a dagger to his conscience. Remembering now with perfect clarity the golden-haired beauty he had partnered through a cotillion while never noticing the grey-clad figure watching from the shadows. Dawn crept across the London sky with fingers of rose and gold, painting the walls of the sick-room in soft pastels that seemed at odds with the gravity of the vigil. Eleanor Ashworth had maintained for nearly 3 days, her grey dress now thoroughly rumpled and bearing the wrinkles of countless hours spent in the same uncomfortable chair, her hair escaping its pins in wisps that framed a face drawn with exhaustion, yet somehow more alive than it had ever appeared in the formal confines of society gatherings. She had dozed fitfully through the night, her head dropping forward before jerking awake with guilty starts, always checking to ensure Alexander still breathed, still remained in his mysterious slumber. And now, as the new day began, she found her carefully constructed walls crumbling like sand castles before an incoming tide. "I fear I am losing what little sense I possessed, Your Grace," she murmured to the still form before her, her voice hoarse from speaking aloud through the long hours. "For here I sit, pouring out my heart to a man who cannot hear me, cannot judge me, cannot turn away in polite disinterest as you surely would if you were awake and forced to endure the ramblings of a plain companion who has forgotten her place entirely." She laughed, a broken sound that held no mirth, and pressed her palms against her burning eyes before continuing with the reckless abandon of one who has passed beyond the boundaries of proper behavior into a strange realm where truth flows unchecked. "But perhaps that is precisely why I can speak so freely now, knowing you will never remember these words, never know that Eleanor Ashworth, that grey shadow who haunts the edges of your mother's life, has harbored such improper thoughts about the mighty Duke of Pembroke." Her gaze travelled over his features with the hungry attention of one who might never have such an opportunity again, memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark lashes fanned against his cheeks, the slight furrow between his brows that remained even in repose. "I have memorized your face, you know, studied it from across countless ballrooms where you moved like a prince among peasants, never knowing that in the shadows stood a woman who could map every expression that crosses those noble features. From the slight tightening around your eyes when Lord Harrington bores you with his talk of hunting to the way your mouth curves, just slightly, when something truly amuses you, which happens far less often than those around you seem to realize." She reached out with trembling fingers to smooth an imaginary wrinkle from his sheet, careful not to actually touch him, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "There was a dance once, 3 years past at the Montague Ball, when fate or perhaps simple numbers forced you to partner me for a country dance. And though you surely performed the steps by rote, thinking of more important matters or prettier partners, I have treasured that memory like a miser hoards gold, remembering how your hand felt in mine, how you smelled of sandalwood and something uniquely you, how for those brief minutes I existed as more than furniture in your world, even if you forgot my name the moment the music ended." Morning light streamed more fully through the windows now, illuminating the tears that had begun to slip unchecked down Eleanor's cheeks as she sat beside Alexander's still form, her exhaustion and emotional turmoil finally overwhelming the careful control she had maintained throughout her long vigil, and she found herself leaning forward, drawn by a force stronger than propriety or reason toward the man who had unknowingly held her heart for so long. "I should not speak such things, even to your sleeping form," she whispered brokenly, her voice catching on a sob she could no longer suppress. "But I fear if I do not say them now, I shall carry them to my grave unspoken. Another secret buried beneath years of grey dresses and silent service, and somehow that seems a greater sin than this improper confession." Alexander, trapped within his paralyzed body, felt his heart racing as he sensed her drawing nearer, every fiber of his being straining against the invisible bonds that held him prisoner, desperate to give some sign that he heard her, understood her, was beginning to feel things he had never expected to feel for the quiet woman he had overlooked for so long. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached out to touch his face, her fingers barely grazing his cheek before pulling back as if burned. But the brief contact sent waves of longing through her already weakened defenses. "You will never wake to know this," she murmured, her breath catching as fresh tears spilled over. "Never know that Eleanor Ashworth loved you with every beat of her foolish heart, loved you despite knowing you could never return such feelings to someone so plain, so invisible, so utterly beneath your notice." The morning sun caught the wetness on her cheeks, making them glisten as she leaned closer still, drawn by 3 days of intimate vigil and a lifetime of suppressed yearning, her lips hovering just above his as she struggled with the last vestiges of propriety. "Forgive me," she breathed against his mouth. "Forgive me this one stolen moment, this single transgression that I shall carry with me always." And then, with the desperate courage of one who believes they have nothing left to lose, she pressed her lips gently to his in a kiss that held all the tenderness, longing, and hopeless love she had harbored in silence for so long. Alexander, summoning every ounce of will he possessed, managed the slightest pressure in return, his lips moving just barely against hers in response to her touch, a movement so small it might have been imagination but which sent Eleanor jerking backward with a gasp, her eyes wide with shock and confusion, as she stared at his still closed eyes, his unchanged expression, her mind racing to rationalize what she was certain she must have imagined in her exhausted emotional state. "No," she whispered, pressing trembling fingers to her lips. "No, that was merely my overwrought imagination, nothing more than the desperate fancy of a woman who has forgotten herself entirely." And she sank back into her chair, her whole body shaking with the magnitude of what she had done, never knowing that Alexander's soul was crying out in frustration at his inability to open his eyes, to speak her name, to tell her that her kiss had been the sweetest torture and greatest gift he had ever received. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Pembroke House as Eleanor emerged from her chambers wearing a fresh blue dress, her hair neatly pinned once more, every trace of the dishevelled woman who had poured out her heart and stolen a kiss carefully erased beneath a mask of propriety that felt like armor against the confusion and guilt threatening to overwhelm her. She moved through the corridors with measured steps, avoiding the path that would take her past the sick room, her hands clasped tightly together to stop their trembling as she tried to convince herself that the morning's events had been nothing more than exhaustion-induced madness, a momentary lapse that could be forgotten if she simply resumed her proper place in the household's careful hierarchy. The sound of an arriving carriage drew her to the window, where she watched with growing dread as Lady Beatrice Harrington descended in a flutter of silk and lace, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of concern that Eleanor recognized as carefully crafted performance, and she knew with sinking certainty that the society beauty had come to claim her place at Alexander's bedside, to be seen as the devoted angel tending to the fallen duke. Eleanor retreated to the morning room, burying herself in correspondence for the Duchess. But the scratch of her pen could not drown out the rustle of silk in the hallway, or Beatrice's tinkling laugh as she spoke to the footman about dear Alexander's tragic condition, in tones that suggested she was already planning their wedding while he lay insensible. Unable to bear the thought of that woman in the sick room where she had bared her soul, Eleanor found herself drawn back despite her resolution to stay away, hovering in the doorway as Beatrice arranged herself artfully beside Alexander's bed, her perfume heavy in the air, drowning out the simple scents of lavender and soap that had marked Eleanor's vigil. "Oh, Your Grace," Beatrice sighed dramatically, not noticing Eleanor's presence. "How tragic that you should be struck down in your prime, though I confess you look quite romantic in repose, like a prince from a fairy story waiting for true love's kiss to awaken you." And she giggled at her own words, while Alexander, trapped in his paralyzed form, felt revulsion rise in his throat at her shallow performance. Beatrice prattled on about the latest gossip, who had worn what to which ball, which marriages were being arranged, her voice grating against his consciousness like nails on slate after days of Eleanor's warm, genuine conversation, and he struggled with renewed desperation to give some sign of awareness, to end this torture of listening to empty words from painted lips when all he wanted was to hear Eleanor's voice again. "I suppose I should leave you to rest," Beatrice finally declared, rising with a rustle of silk. "Though I do hope you can somehow sense my presence. Know that I am here, devoted to your recovery." And she turned to find Eleanor in the doorway, her expression shifting from false sweetness to cold dismissal as she swept past with a cutting remark about how some people simply don't know their place, leaving Eleanor standing frozen while Alexander's soul cried out in silent anguish, willing his body to move, to speak, to somehow let Eleanor know that her kiss had been the only truth in a world of facades. The morning of June 18th dawned grey and drizzly, matching Eleanor's mood as she busied herself with tasks that kept her as far from the sick room as possible, organizing the Duchess's correspondence with meticulous care, supervising the arrangement of flowers in the blue salon, anything to avoid returning to that chamber where she had so thoroughly forgotten herself, and stolen a kiss from a man who would be horrified to learn of such liberties taken with his unconscious form. She sent young Mary with fresh linens and instructed the footman about adjusting the curtains, all while maintaining a careful distance from the east wing where Alexander lay, her cheeks burning anew each time she remembered the soft pressure of his lips that surely she must have imagined in her overwrought state. Meanwhile, in that very sick room, Alexander focused all his considerable will on the simple act of moving his fingers, the frustration of the past days crystallizing into fierce determination as he concentrated on his right hand, willing the digits to obey his commands, knowing that Eleanor was somewhere in the house avoiding him, probably drowning in misplaced guilt over a kiss that had been the sweetest moment of his life. The effort was exhausting, sweat beading on his forehead as he strained against the invisible bonds holding him prisoner, but slowly, incrementally, he felt the faintest twitch in his index finger, then another, until he could manage a deliberate tap against the coverlet, a small victory that felt monumental after days of complete paralysis. The sound of the door opening made him cease his efforts, listening as footsteps approached, heavier than Eleanor's light tread. And then Lord Thomas Sinclair's familiar voice filled the room with forced cheer as his oldest friend settled into the chair beside the bed, launching into tales of their university days designed to rouse him from his supposed coma. "The physician says you may be in there somewhere, old friend," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "And if you are, if you can hear me, know that your mother is beside herself with worry, and that peculiar little companion of hers has apparently taken ill after spending 3 days at your bedside, though no one seems to know quite what's wrong with her." At the mention of Eleanor, Alexander redoubled his efforts, managing to tap his finger more firmly against the coverlet, once, twice, 3 times in deliberate succession, causing Thomas to break off mid-sentence and lean forward with sudden sharp attention. "Alexander," Thomas whispered, his voice tight with hope and disbelief. "Was that... Can you hear me?" And when Alexander managed another series of taps, his friend let out a strangled sound that was half laugh, half sob, grasping his hand and feeling the deliberate pressure of fingers that had been lifeless just days before. "Good God! You're in there, you're actually conscious," Thomas breathed, his mind racing as Alexander continued to tap urgently, trying desperately to convey his need for Eleanor, his fingers drumming out a rhythm that his friend couldn't quite decipher but recognized as purposeful communication. "I'll fetch the physician immediately," Thomas declared, rising from his chair, but Alexander's fingers clenched weakly around his hand, holding him in place as he tapped more insistently, and something in the desperate rhythm made Thomas pause, studying his friend's face intently as understanding began to dawn. "Not the physician," Thomas said slowly. "Someone else, then? Your mother?" But Alexander's fingers went still, and Thomas watched his face carefully as he began listing names, noting the lack of response until he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, "Miss Ashworth?" And Alexander's fingers clenched so tightly that Thomas gasped at the unexpected strength. "Eleanor Ashworth? The companion?" Thomas asked in bewilderment, but Alexander's continued tapping left no doubt, and though confusion clouded his features, Thomas nodded slowly. "Very well. If that's what you want, I'll fetch her immediately, though God knows why you'd want that mouse of a woman when you could have anyone." But he was already moving toward the door, missing the way Alexander's jaw clenched at the dismissive description of the woman who had unknowingly captured his heart with her whispered confessions and stolen kiss. Thomas found Eleanor in the farthest corner of the garden, hidden behind a trellis of climbing roses where she sat with a book she wasn't reading, her fingers tracing the same line over and over as her mind churned with mortification at what she had done in that moment of exhausted weakness when she had pressed her lips to those of a man who could not consent or refuse. And when Thomas's shadow fell across her page, she started violently, the book tumbling from her lap as she rose hastily to her feet, already stammering excuses about needing to return to her duties. "Miss Ashworth, please, a moment of your time," Thomas said urgently, catching her arm as she tried to brush past him, and something in his voice made her pause despite her desperate desire to flee, though she kept her eyes fixed firmly on the ground rather than meet his concerned gaze. "Lord Sinclair." "I really must return to the house. The Duchess requires—" Eleanor began, but Thomas interrupted with uncharacteristic firmness. "The Duke requires your presence in his sick room immediately." And Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she wondered if somehow Alexander had awakened and revealed her shocking breach of propriety to his friend. "I cannot," she whispered, pulling her arm free and backing away. "It would be highly improper for me to continue visiting His Grace's chambers now that the immediate crisis has passed, and I'm certain the physician would prefer—" But again Thomas cut across her protests, his expression growing more puzzled and insistent by the moment. "Miss Ashworth, I don't understand your sudden reluctance when you spent 3 days at his bedside without complaint. But I assure you that your presence is not just requested but essential," he said, studying her pale face and trembling hands with growing confusion, wondering what had transpired to transform the devoted nurse into this skittish creature trying to disappear into the roses. "You don't understand," Eleanor said desperately, her voice catching as she fought back tears of shame. "I cannot go back there. I've already overstepped so grievously, taken advantage of His Grace's condition in ways that would horrify any person of proper feeling, and I won't compound my errors by continuing this inappropriate vigil." Thomas's brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of her words, but his confusion was overshadowed by his urgency to fulfill Alexander's desperate request, and he leaned forward intently. "Miss Ashworth, whatever you imagine you've done wrong, I can assure you that the Duke harbours no ill will. Quite the contrary, he specifically asked for you." Eleanor's head snapped up at that, her eyes wide with shock as she stammered, "Asked for me? But how could he? The physician said he was insensible, that he might never—" And she trailed off as the implications of Thomas's words began to penetrate her panic-stricken mind, a different kind of horror dawning as she considered the possibility that Alexander might have been aware during her visits. "Please," Thomas said more gently, seeing her distress. "I cannot explain everything here, but Alexander needs to see you, and despite whatever reservations you may have, I believe you need to see him as well, if only to put your fears to rest about whatever transgression you imagine you've committed." And he offered her his arm with the encouraging smile, though inside he burned with curiosity about what could have passed between the unconscious Duke and this unremarkable companion that would cause such mutual desperation. Eleanor entered the sick room with all the rigid formality of a soldier marching to battle, her spine straight and her expression carefully composed into the bland mask she had perfected over years of fading into the background of grand houses, though her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the severe grey dress she had deliberately chosen to replace the blue one that now seemed too hopeful, too presumptuous for a companion who had forgotten her place so thoroughly. The familiar scent of beeswax candles and medicinal herbs wrapped around her like an accusation as she approached the bed where Alexander lay still and silent, his face pale against the white pillows, looking exactly as he had during her shameful vigil when she had poured out her heart to unhearing ears and then compounded her foolishness with that stolen kiss that even now made her cheeks burn with mortification. "Your Grace," she said stiffly, addressing his unconscious form with none of the warm familiarity that had crept into her voice during those long hours of one-sided conversation. "Lord Sinclair insisted upon my presence, though I cannot imagine why, as the maids are perfectly capable of tending to your needs without requiring my amateur ministrations." She moved to the window, adjusting curtains that needed no adjustment, her back to the bed as she continued in that same carefully neutral tone. "I trust you will forgive my previous oversights in maintaining proper boundaries between a duke and a mere companion, lapses in judgment brought about by exhaustion and an excess of misguided concern that led me to speak with unwarranted familiarity during your illness." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, each formal phrase a small death to the connection she had imagined between them during those intimate hours, but she forced herself to continue, needing to establish distance, to rebuild the walls that had crumbled so dangerously during her vigil. "I shall ensure that your care continues with appropriate staff, while maintaining the proper discretion that my position demands," she went on, still facing the window where the last rays of evening sunlight painted the garden in shades of gold and amber, unable to look at his still form without remembering how his lips had felt beneath hers. That phantom pressure she must have imagined in her overwrought state. Behind her, unknown to Eleanor as she delivered her stilted speech, Alexander fought against the lingering paralysis with every fibre of his being, his eyes burning with the effort to open, his throat working to produce sound, desperate to stop her from retreating behind those walls of propriety before he could tell her the truth that had been burning in his chest for days. The effort was monumental, like pushing against invisible chains, but the sound of Eleanor's formal, distant voice gave him strength born of desperation, and finally, with a supreme act of will that left him trembling, he managed to force his eyes open and push a single word past his lips in a voice rough with disuse, but clear enough to shatter the careful composure Eleanor had wrapped around herself like armor. "Eleanor." The sound of her name on his lips hit Eleanor like a physical blow, freezing her in place as surely as if she had been turned to stone. Her hand still extended toward the curtains she had been adjusting, while every drop of blood in her veins seemed to crystallize into ice as the horrible, wonderful, terrible truth crashed over her in waves of understanding that left her gasping for breath she couldn't seem to draw into her lungs. She whirled around, her eyes wide with horror as they met his. Those grey depths she had gazed into for so many hours when she thought them unseeing, now fully aware and fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her knees threaten to buckle beneath her, and in that moment she knew with devastating certainty that he had heard everything, every confession, every secret, every shameful declaration of love she had poured out to what she believed was an unconscious man. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible as she began backing toward the door, her hands raised as if to ward off the truth of what she was seeing. "No, no, this cannot be. You were unconscious. The physician said you were insensible, that you couldn't hear or understand. But even as the desperate denials tumbled from her lips, she could see the truth written in his eyes, the recognition, the knowledge of all she had revealed. Alexander struggled to speak again, his voice still rough and weak but growing stronger with urgency as he saw her retreat. "Eleanor, please don't go! You must let me explain!" But she was already shaking her head frantically, tears streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of her humiliation crashed down upon her. Remembering every word she had spoken, every touch she had given, and worst of all, that kiss she had stolen from lips she thought would never know. "I trusted that you couldn't hear me," she choked out, her voice breaking on a sob as she continued backing away. "I thought I was safe to speak the truth of my pathetic feelings, to confess things I would never have dared say if I had known you were aware. And now you must think me the most presumptuous, the most forward, the most desperate creature." And she pressed her hands to her burning cheeks as if she could somehow contain the shame that threatened to consume her. "Eleanor, stop," Alexander commanded with as much authority as his weakened state could muster. And when she continued her retreat, he did the only thing he could think of, throwing off his covers with trembling hands and attempting to rise from the bed, despite the way the room spun sickeningly around him, driven by the desperate need to reach her before she fled beyond his reach forever. And it was only when he swayed dangerously, nearly falling, that Eleanor's instinct to help overcame her mortification, and she rushed forward to steady him, her hands automatically going to his arms to support him even as she tried to keep her face averted from his searching gaze. The morning sun streamed through the heavy curtains of Eleanor's modest chamber in the east wing of Pembroke House, finding her exactly where she had been since fleeing Alexander's sick room the previous evening, barricaded behind her locked door with a chair wedged beneath the handle for good measure, though she knew such precautions were unnecessary, as no duke would dare venture into the servants' quarters, even if he weren't still recovering from a head injury that should have left him insensible to her mortifying confessions. She had ignored every summons through the night, first from concerned maids wondering why she hadn't appeared for supper, then from the housekeeper Mrs. Pemberton demanding to know if she was ill, and finally from the Duchess herself, who had knocked gently at 10 o'clock, expressing worry about her sudden indisposition, to all of whom Eleanor had claimed through the door to be suffering from a severe headache that required complete solitude to recover. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but not nearly as bitter as the thought of facing anyone who might see the truth written across her burning face. The truth that she had made an absolute fool of herself before the one man whose opinion she valued above all others, pouring out her heart to someone she believed unconscious, only to discover he had heard every pathetic word, every desperate confession, every shameful declaration of a love that could never be returned by a duke to a mere companion. 3 floors below in the master suite, Alexander Pembroke sat upright in his bed for the first time since his accident, his strength returning with remarkable speed now that he had a purpose beyond mere physical recovery, though the physician Dr. Hartwell stood beside him with deep disapproval etched across his weathered features, insisting that his grace needed at least another week of complete bed rest to avoid risking permanent damage from his head injury. "Your Grace, I must protest most strenuously," the doctor was saying, even as Alexander swung his legs over the side of the bed, testing their steadiness. "You have suffered a severe trauma, and this premature activity could result in complications that—" But his words fell on deaf ears as Alexander focused instead on Thomas Sinclair, who stood near the window, having arrived at his urgent summons just after dawn. "She has locked herself away," Alexander said, cutting through the physician's protests with the authority that came naturally to him despite his weakened state, "and refuses all visitors according to my mother, claiming illness that we all know is nothing more than mortification over last night's revelation." and his jaw tightened with determination as he gripped the bedpost and pulled himself to standing, swaying only slightly as the room tilted before settling back into place. "Perhaps if you wrote to her," Thomas suggested carefully, watching his friend with concern as Alexander took a tentative step forward, then another, each movement stronger than the last, as if sheer will could overcome physical limitation. "A letter explaining your feelings might be received more favorably than a personal visit which she clearly wishes to avoid." Alexander's grey eyes, so like Eleanor's own, though she would never know it, flashed with frustration as he reached for the silk dressing gown his valet held ready, his movements still slower than usual, but gaining coordination with each passing moment, driven by an urgency that wouldn't be denied by something as trivial as a physician's orders or society's conventions about proper behavior between a duke and his mother's companion. The afternoon sun slanted through the narrow windows of Eleanor's chamber as she folded her few possessions into a worn traveling case, her movements mechanical and precise as she tried not to think about what she was leaving behind, about the life she had built here in service to the Duchess, who had shown her nothing but kindness, about the man 3 floors below who now knew every secret her foolish heart had harbored, and most of all, about the fact that she would never again see those grey eyes that had haunted her dreams for longer than she cared to admit. She had already penned her letter of resignation to the Duchess, citing urgent family matters that required her immediate presence in the countryside, a lie that would at least preserve some shred of her dignity as she fled from the mortification that threatened to consume her, though she knew the Duchess would see through such a transparent excuse and wonder at her sudden departure after years of faithful service. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made her freeze, her hand stilling on the simple grey dress she had been folding, the very one she had worn during those long hours at Alexander's bedside, when she had poured out her heart to what she believed was an insensible man. And she held her breath as the footsteps paused outside her door, followed by a knock that was neither the timid tap of a maid nor the brisk rap of Mrs. Pemberton. "Eleanor," came Alexander's voice through the heavy oak, and the sound of her given name on his lips sent a shock through her entire being. For surely a duke would never lower himself to seek out a mere companion in the servants' quarters, would never climb 3 flights of stairs while still recovering from a head injury that should have kept him confined to bed, would never abandon every rule of propriety that governed their carefully separated worlds. "I know you're in there," he continued, and she could hear the slight breathlessness in his voice that spoke of his exertion, could picture him leaning heavily on his cane as Dr. Hartwell had insisted he use, though knowing Alexander's stubborn nature, he had probably attempted the climb without it at first. "And I know you're planning to leave. My mother showed me your letter of resignation, and I will not allow you to disappear from my life without hearing what I have to say." Eleanor pressed her back against the door, as if she could somehow reinforce the barrier between them, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it. And when she finally found her voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Your Grace, this is highly improper. You shouldn't be here. If anyone were to see you at my door, the scandal would be immeasurable, and you're still recovering. You should be resting, not climbing stairs, and certainly not pursuing someone who has already embarrassed herself beyond all redemption." "Hang propriety," Alexander said with such vehemence that Eleanor gasped, for never in all her years of service had she heard him speak so carelessly of society's rules. "And hang what anyone thinks, Eleanor, you spoke to me of watching from shadows, of being invisible, of accepting a half-life because you believed that was all you deserved. But don't you understand that your words, your beautiful, honest, heart-breaking words, they saved me in ways no physician ever could. They gave me a reason to fight my way back to consciousness when it would have been so much easier to simply let go and drift away into that peaceful darkness that beckoned so seductively during those first terrible hours after my accident." The silence that stretched between them through the heavy oak door seemed to pulse with all the words that had been spoken, and those yet to be said, until finally Eleanor heard a soft thump against the wood that could only be Alexander resting his forehead against it in exhaustion or frustration, or perhaps both. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that she had never heard from the proud Duke of Pembroke, not in all her years of watching him from the edges of ballrooms and formal dinners. "Do you remember the midsummer ball 3 years ago?" he said, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat because of course she remembered. How could she forget the single dance they had shared when Caroline had twisted her ankle and begged Eleanor to take her place in the set? You wore a green silk dress, not grey, and you had jasmine flowers in your hair. And when I took your hand for the allemande, you trembled, but your grip was steady, and you smelled of vanilla and old books. And when the music ended, you curtsied and disappeared before I could ask your name. Eleanor's legs gave way and she sank to the floor, her back still pressed against the door, tears streaming down her face as she realized he had remembered, had noticed, had perhaps even looked for her afterward, just as he claimed, and her voice was thick with unshed sobs when she whispered, "Your Grace, please don't. I cannot bear your pity, cannot endure you pretending to care simply because I made such a fool of myself at your bedside." "Pity?" Alexander's voice rose with something close to anger, though it was directed at himself rather than her. "Eleanor, I have spent 3 years searching every ballroom, every garden party, every musical evening for a glimpse of green silk and jasmine flowers, only to learn that you were there all along, hidden in grey, invisible by choice because you believed yourself unworthy of being seen, and I was too proud, too foolish to look beyond the obvious, to see that the woman who haunted my dreams was the same one who stood so quietly beside my mother, who lowered her eyes when I entered a room, who disappeared into shadows whenever I drew near." The tears came faster now as Eleanor pressed her palms against the door, feeling the warmth of his presence on the other side, knowing he was mere inches away yet separated by barriers both physical and social that seemed insurmountable, even as her heart cried out to open the door, to see his face, to know if his eyes held the truth, his words proclaimed. "But I am nobody," she said, her voice breaking on the words she had told herself so many times. They had become her truth. "I am a companion, a shadow, a convenience. And you are the Duke of Pembroke. You could have anyone, Lady Beatrice or any of the dozen beautiful, accomplished women who pursue you every season, women who were born to be duchesses, not spinsters who read to invalids and fetch shawls and accept their place in the margins of life." "Then let me be clear," Alexander said, and she heard the sound of movement, the soft tap of his cane against the floor, the rustle of fabric that suggested he was doing something unexpected. "I am not standing anymore, Eleanor. I am kneeling outside your door, a duke on his knees in the servants' corridor, because I would rather humble myself before the woman I love than live another day in a world where she believes herself unworthy of being seen, being known, being cherished exactly as she is." The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Pembroke House drawing-room, casting long shadows across the Persian rug, as Eleanor sat rigidly on the edge of a silk-upholstered chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, wearing her best morning dress of soft lavender muslin that Caroline had insisted she borrow, though she felt like an impostor in anything but her customary grey, and across from her sat the Duchess of Pembroke, her expression unreadable as she poured tea with the same elegant precision she brought to every task, while Alexander stood by the mantelpiece, his hand gripping his silver-headed cane, though Eleanor suspected it was more for something to hold than from any real need for support. "I have asked you both here this morning," Alexander began, his voice formal but with an underlying tension that made Eleanor's heart race, "because I have something of great importance to discuss with you, Mother, regarding Miss Ashworth." And at the use of her formal name, Eleanor felt a chill run through her, wondering if perhaps he had reconsidered, if the dawn light had brought clarity and the realization of just how impossible a match between them would be. But then Alexander moved from the mantelpiece to stand beside her chair, his free hand coming to rest lightly on the carved wooden back, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "Alexander," the Duchess said, setting down her teacup with a delicate clink that somehow managed to convey volumes of maternal concern. "If this is about Miss Ashworth's resignation, I have already spoken to her about reconsidering, as I cannot imagine managing without her assistance, particularly after her extraordinary devotion during your recent illness." And Eleanor felt her cheeks burn as she remembered those long hours at his bedside, the confessions that had poured from her lips, the kiss that had changed everything. "No, Mother," Alexander said, and Eleanor could hear the smile in his voice even though she dared not look up at him. "This is not about Eleanor's position as your companion. Rather, I am here to formally request your blessing to court her with the intention of making her my wife." And the words hung in the air like a challenge to the very foundations of their carefully ordered world, causing the Duchess to set down her teacup with rather more force than usual, the delicate china rattling against the saucer. "I beg your pardon?" the Duchess said, her voice rising slightly. And Eleanor finally raised her eyes to see the older woman's face had gone quite pale. "Alexander, surely you cannot be serious. Miss Ashworth is a lovely girl, quite devoted and accomplished in her way, but she is a companion. And you are the Duke of Pembroke. You have responsibilities to your name, to your lineage, to society itself." And each word felt like a small dagger to Eleanor's heart, confirming every fear she had harbored about her unworthiness. But before she could speak, before she could flee as every instinct demanded, Alexander's hand moved from the chair to rest gently on her shoulder, the weight of it both protective and claiming. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the rose arbor as guests gathered in the manicured gardens of Pembroke House, the gentle murmur of polite conversation mixing with the tinkling of crystal and china, while Eleanor stood beside a potted orange tree, trying to make herself invisible despite the rose silk gown the Duchess had insisted she wear, a dress that seemed to draw every eye in a way her grey wool never had. And she found herself wishing desperately for the familiar anonymity of her companion's attire, even as Alexander's steady presence at her elbow reminded her that invisibility was no longer an option, not when the Duke of Pembroke had made it abundantly clear through his attentions that Miss Eleanor Ashworth was under his particular protection. "Quite a lovely gathering, Your Grace," Lady Beatrice Harrington said, gliding toward them in a confection of pale blue muslin that complemented her golden curls perfectly, her smile sharp as cut glass, while her eyes swept over Eleanor with barely concealed disdain. "Though I must confess myself surprised to see certain persons elevated so far above their natural station." And the words hung in the air like a challenge that made Eleanor's stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Alexander's hand found the small of Eleanor's back, the touch light but unmistakably possessive, as he replied with a coolness that would have frozen July. "Indeed, Lady Beatrice, I find society often fails to recognize true worth, preferring instead to value the arbitrary circumstances of birth over the genuine qualities of character and intelligence that actually matter." And Eleanor felt the ripple of shock that went through the nearby guests who had been pretending not to eavesdrop on the exchange. "How very democratic of you," Lady Beatrice continued, her fan fluttering in a way that drew attention to her elegant hands. "Though one must wonder at the timing of such revelations, coming so soon after your unfortunate accident, when perhaps your judgment might still be somewhat impaired." And Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, even as anger sparked in her chest at the implication that Alexander's regard for her could only be the product of a damaged mind. "On the contrary," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, so that even those guests who had been maintaining the polite fiction of not listening turned openly to watch. My accident had the singular benefit of clearing my vision entirely, allowing me to see past the superficial decorations that society mistakes for worth to the genuine treasures that hide in plain sight. And I can assure you, Lady Beatrice, that my judgment has never been clearer than it is at this moment, standing beside a woman whose courage, intelligence, and compassion outshine any mere accident of birth or fortune. The garden had gone completely silent, except for the distant splash of the fountain and the drowsy hum of bees in the roses, every eye fixed on their small group as Lady Beatrice's perfect complexion mottled with ugly red patches, and Eleanor stood frozen between mortification and a wild, desperate hope that Alexander truly meant the words he spoke with such fierce conviction. The Westbrook ballroom shimmered with the light of 1,000 candles reflecting off crystal chandeliers and mirrors that lined the walls, creating an enchanted atmosphere that made Eleanor feel as though she had stepped into a fairy tale, though the green silk gown she wore, another loan from the Duchess's own modiste, still felt foreign against her skin compared to the familiar comfort of grey wool. And as she stood at the entrance beside Alexander, she could feel the weight of every eye in the room turning toward them, the whispers rising like a tide that threatened to drown her new-found confidence, until Alexander's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own in a gesture that was both protective and proudly possessive. "Shall we give them something proper to talk about?" he murmured close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin as the orchestra struck up the opening notes of a waltz, and before she could voice any of the dozen protests that rose to her lips, he was leading her onto the dance floor, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea, and Eleanor found herself in his arms once more, though this time everything was different from that night 3 years ago, when she had been merely another anonymous figure in grey, practically invisible even as she danced in his arms. "Do you remember?" Alexander said softly as he guided her through the opening steps, with a grace that belied his recent injury. "The last time we danced in this very ballroom, it was a Tuesday evening in April. You wore grey silk with small pearl buttons, and you quoted Shakespeare when I complimented the weather, something about the uncertain glory of an April day, and I thought you were the most intriguing woman I had ever met. Yet when the dance ended, you vanished like smoke, and I spent the rest of that season looking for a grey ghost who seemed to exist only in my imagination." Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest as she looked up into his dark eyes, seeing in them a warmth and intensity that made her forget the hundreds of people watching their every move. "You remember that night? But how is that possible when you danced with so many ladies, when I was nothing but a companion who had no business accepting your invitation in the first place?" And her voice caught on the words, as the memory of that long-ago evening rose vivid in her mind, the way she had lived on that single dance for years, treasuring it like a miser hoards gold. "I remember," Alexander said, spinning her through a complex turn that brought her closer to his chest. "Because you were the only woman who ever made me laugh during a waltz, the only one who responded to banal pleasantries with actual wit, the only one who looked at me as though you could see through all the ducal nonsense to the man beneath, and then you disappeared, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined you entirely. And I was too proud, too stupid to simply ask who you were, assuming that any woman who interested me would make herself known, never realizing that the most precious treasures often hide in plain sight, wrapped in grey wool and self-effacement." The first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold as Eleanor made her way through the garden paths of Pembroke House, seeking solitude among the summer roses that bloomed in riotous abundance, their perfume heavy in the still morning air, while dew still clung to petals and leaves like scattered diamonds. and she had risen early specifically to avoid the household, needing time to think without the constant pressure of servants' curious glances and the Duchess's well-meaning but overwhelming attempts to transform her from companion to future Duchess. A transformation that still felt surreal despite the events of the past fortnight. She found her favorite bench beneath the arbor, where white roses climbed in wild profusion, the same bench where she had so often sat with a book while the Duchess napped, watching the great house from a safe distance, and dreaming impossible dreams about the Duke who moved through her life like a distant star, brilliant but untouchable. And now that same Duke pursued her with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her, making her question everything she had believed about her place in the world. The crunch of gravel on the path made her heart leap even before she turned to see Alexander approaching through the morning mist, his tall figure still showing signs of his recent injury in the careful way he moved, though he had abandoned the cane despite his physician's protests. And the sight of him here in her sanctuary, dressed simply in riding clothes with his dark hair still tousled from sleep, made her pulse race in a way that no amount of stern self-lecture could prevent. "I thought I might find you here," he said softly as he approached, his eyes warm with an emotion that made her breath catch. "Mother mentioned this was your particular refuge, though I confess I've been awake since 4, wondering if I would have the courage to do what I came here to do." And something in his voice, a vulnerability she had only heard during those long hours in the sick room, made her rise from the bench as he drew closer. "Your Grace," she began, but he shook his head with a rueful smile that transformed his usually austere features into something achingly tender. "Alexander, please, for what I'm about to say cannot be said to titles, but only to the woman who held my hand through darkness and showed me what it truly means to be seen." And before she could fully process his words, he was lowering himself carefully to one knee among the rose petals, his movements still stiff from his healing injuries, but his intention unmistakable as he reached for her trembling hand. The morning of August 20th dawned clear and bright over Pembroke Chapel, where the ancient stone walls seemed to glow with warmth despite the early hour. And Eleanor stood before the mirror in the vestry, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her in ivory silk and Alençon lace, a creation that had caused the Duchess to weep when she first saw it, declaring that no daughter of her own could have looked more beautiful, though Eleanor still felt like an imposter playing at being a duchess until Caroline adjusted her veil with gentle fingers and whispered that she had never seen her sister look more like herself, more radiant with a joy that came from within rather than from any external transformation. The chapel bells began their joyous pealing as guests filled the pews, a mix of society's highest and those who truly mattered, including several companions and governesses who had been specifically invited despite raised eyebrows from certain quarters, for Alexander had insisted their wedding would honor all aspects of their story, not just the fairy tale ending, but the quiet years of service that had shaped Eleanor into the woman he loved. As the organ music swelled and Eleanor began her walk down the aisle on the arm of Thomas, who had gallantly offered to give her away in the absence of any male relatives, she saw Alexander waiting at the altar, his face transformed by an expression of such profound love and anticipation that her heart seemed to expand beyond the confines of her chest. And when their eyes met across the length of the chapel, she saw in them the same wonder that had filled them that morning in the sick room when he first spoke her name, as though he still could not quite believe she was real and his. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ancient words and promises that felt both weighty and weightless. But it was during Thomas's speech at the wedding breakfast that the gathered company learned the full truth of their romance, how Alexander had regained consciousness far earlier than anyone but Thomas had known, how he had spent days listening to Eleanor's confessions and falling desperately in love with the woman who spoke to him with such honesty and wit, who read to him with such feeling, who saw past his title to the man beneath, and how he had begged Thomas to maintain the fiction because he feared that once Eleanor knew he was awake, she would retreat behind the walls of propriety that society demanded. Caroline, radiant in soft blue as maid of honor, raised her glass with tears streaming down her cheeks as she spoke of always knowing her sister possessed a rare and special heart that simply needed the right person to recognize its worth, while the Duchess herself stood to declare that in gaining Eleanor as a daughter, she had not lost a companion, but gained something infinitely more precious, a woman who had saved her son not just from his physical injuries, but from a lifetime of emotional isolation. And as the afternoon light slanted through the windows of Pembroke House's ballroom, where they held their wedding breakfast, Eleanor felt the last of her old uncertainties dissolve like morning mist before the sun, replaced by a bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, not because she had won a duke's heart, but because she had found someone who saw her truly and loved her, not despite her years in grey obscurity, but because of all the strength and grace those years had given her. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of what had once been the sick room at Pembroke House, now transformed into a bright and cheerful nursery, where Eleanor, Duchess of Pembroke, sat in the same chair she had occupied during those fateful days 5 years ago, though now, instead of watching over an unconscious duke, she presided over the delightful chaos of 4-year-old twins who demanded to hear once again the story of how Mamma and Papa had fallen in love, a tale they never tired of hearing, despite knowing every word by heart. Little Margaret, named for her grandmother, climbed into Eleanor's lap, while young James, the image of his father with the same dark hair and serious eyes, sat at her feet, both children settling in with the expectation of hearing their favorite fairy tale, though Eleanor always insisted it was better than any fairy tale because it was absolutely true. Every word of it. "Once upon a time," she began, smoothing Margaret's auburn curls that were so like her own, "there was a lady who wore only grey dresses and tried very hard to be invisible, who spent her days reading to a kind duchess and believed that was all her life would ever be." And the children giggled, because they could never imagine their vibrant mother trying to disappear, their mamma who hosted the most wonderful parties and made even the stuffiest lords laugh with her clever observations. "But then," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the dramatic tone her children loved, "the Duchess's son, a very proud and lonely duke, fell from his horse and couldn't wake up, and the invisible lady was asked to sit by his bedside and watch over him." And here Margaret always interrupted to ask if Papa was very handsome, even while sleeping, to which Eleanor would solemnly confirm that he was devastatingly so, which made the danger to her heart all the greater. The door opened just as Eleanor reached the part about confessing secrets to a sleeping duke, and Alexander himself entered, moving with the easy grace that showed no trace of his long-ago injuries, his face lighting up at the sight of his family gathered in what he had long ago dubbed their lucky room, and the twins immediately clamored for him to join their story circle, which he did by settling on the arm of Eleanor's chair and pressing a kiss to her temple that still, after 5 years of marriage, sent a flutter through her heart. "Are you telling them about my dramatic swoon again?" he asked with mock severity that didn't fool the children for a moment. "I'll have you know I was unconscious with great dignity and considerable style," which made James protest that Papa couldn't have been stylish because he was asleep, while Margaret insisted that of course he was stylish because Papa was always stylish, even in his sleep, and Eleanor laughed at their innocent debate while her hand found Alexander's and squeezed gently, a silent communication that spoke of shared memories and enduring love that needed no words, though words had certainly played their part in bringing them together.